Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into Microsoft Azure Cosmos DB. We got this really interesting piece from datapro.news asking, could Cosmos DB be that Swiss Army knife for data?
It's a great question, isn't it? And a really powerful analogy. Because so many people are juggling different databases. NoSQL, relational, now vector stuff for AI.
Right.
So the idea of one service handling all that, it's appealing. Our mission today really is to unpack that based on the article. Look at the strengths, sure, but also the potential gotchas.
Exactly. Moving past the hype.
Yeah.
Because, consolidating databases sounds great. The article mentions support for all these APIs, NoSQL, MongoDB, Postgres, Cassandra, Gremlin. That's ambitious, trying to be the one service for so many different needs.
Very ambitious.
So, okay, let's start with the positives. According to the article, where does Cosmos DB really shine?
Well, the big headline is scalability and performance. That's where they lead. The promise is guaranteed speed at any scale, which is quite a claim.
Okay.
Well,
What does that
right.
mean in practice?
It means things like single-digit millisecond response times, automatic global scaling, like instantly. So if your app suddenly gets huge traffic worldwide,
Like a Black Friday sale or something.
exactly, it's designed to just handle it. Elastic scaling of throughput, the processing power, and storage across all the Azure regions you need.
And those specific numbers. The article mentions some latency figures.
Yeah, they're pretty impressive. For a typical 1 KB item, they guarantee reads under 10 milliseconds and index writes under 15 milliseconds. That's at the 99th percentile within the same Azure region, so pretty fast.
That is fast. And they mentioned something about migrating. Serverless to provisioned.
Ah, yes. That's a newer feature, now generally available, apparently. A one-click migration from the serverless consumption model to the provisioned throughput model with no downtime. Makes it easier to scale up smoothly as your application grows,
Okay. That sounds genuinely useful. So
Yeah.
performance, scalability, what else?
Developer productivity is another big one the article flags. Things like having SDKs ready to go for .NET, Java, Node.js, Python, plus the drivers for those different APIs we mentioned.
Right. Gets you started faster.
Exactly. And for the NoSQL API, the schemaless nature is a big plus for developers. You can iterate quickly, change your data model without huge migrations early on. It's flexible.
And the change feed, that sounded interesting for reactive systems.
Yeah, the change feed is really powerful. It lets you listen to changes happening in your database containers, so you can easily build event-driven stuff. Like the article mentions triggering Azure functions whenever data changes.
Nice. Decoupled architecture.
And they also mentioned the new JavaScript SDK version 4.0 is out with improvements for querying, bulk operations, things like that. Good news for the Node.js crowd.
Okay. And then there was the AI angle. That seems huge now.
Oh, definitely. The article really emphasizes Cosmos DB's push into AI workloads. This was apparently a big focus at Microsoft Build 2025.
The vector search.
Exactly. Native vector indexing and search right inside your documents. You can store those high-dimensional vectors, the embeddings from your AI models, alongside your regular data.
Which has to be more efficient, right? Not moving data between systems.
Precisely. Co-locating the data and the vectors is a big win. And you can combine vector search with your normal NoSQL filters. The article mentions Discan as the underlying index tech, which suggests they're serious about performance here.
Makes sense. Okay, so performance, developer ease, AI.
Yeah.
What about just, keeping the lights on? Mission critical stuff.
Right, reliability. The article covers the SLAs, the service level agreements. They offer guarantees on throughput, latency, availability, even consistency levels. The standout is probably the 99.9999% read availability if you're using a multi-region account. 5 nines.
Wow, okay. That's serious uptime.
Yeah. And you have options for multi-region writes too, plus automatic data replication. So it's built for resilience for those global apps that just can't go down.
And underpinning all this is the managed aspect, not having to actually run the database yourself.
That's a huge part of the appeal, isn't it? Offloading all that admin work, patching, updates, scaling the infrastructure. Developers can just focus on building their app.
Okay, so that's a pretty strong case for the pro column. Powerful, scalable, developer-friendly, AI-ready, reliable. But the article wasn't just a glowing review. It also flagged some serious potential downsides. Where do we need to be careful?
Yeah, absolutely. And the first, maybe the biggest point of caution is cost. The article really stresses this. Cosmos DB is powerful, but it can get expensive if you're not paying attention.
How does the pricing work?
It's mainly based on two things: request units per second, or RUs, which is like your reserve processing power,
Yeah.
and the amount of storage you use.
Then what makes the cost shoot up?
Well, one thing is the default indexing. By default, Cosmos DB indexes every field in your JSON documents, which is great for query flexibility, but consumes more RUs for writes. And as one user in the article apparently said, performance increases can make costs skyrocket.
Ouch. So you really need to optimize. Query patterns, indexing strategy.
Exactly. Choosing the right consistency level matters too, and definitely how you partition your data. It all feeds into RU consumption. You need to understand how it works to manage costs effectively.
Which leads to the next point, I guess. Complexity.
Yes. The sheer number of options, all those APIs, consistency levels, indexing choices, partitioning strategies, it creates a pretty significant learning curve. There is a Redditor quoted warning, it's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot.
Yeah, I can see that. Too many knobs to fiddle with if you don't know what you're doing.
Right. And some decisions you make up front, especially around your data model and your partition key, are really hard to change later. They have big implications.
Okay, let's talk about that partition key. The article seemed to really emphasize this as a potential pain point.
It's absolutely fundamental. The partition key determines how Cosmos DB spreads your data and workload across its underlying physical partitions. Think of it like sharding in other databases.
And the big limitation is?
You cannot change the partition key for a container once it's set. Not in place, anyway, so you have to get it right, or at least right enough from the start.
What happens if you get it wrong?
You can end up with hot partitions. That's where one partition gets way more traffic than others, leads to performance bottlenecks, throttling, and potentially really expensive cross-partition queries if your queries don't filter by the partition key.
So choosing that key is critical for both performance and cost.
Absolutely critical. Though the article did mention global secondary indexes, or GSIs, are now in public preview. That offers a potential way around some query limitations, letting you query efficiently on other fields without needing a perfect partition key for every single query. So that's promising.
Okay. What about querying itself? The SQL API looks familiar, but the article mentions some quirks.
Yeah, quirks is a good word. While the SQL API uses familiar syntax, it's not a relational database. Complex joins, for example, aren't really its strong suit. And like we said, if your query filter doesn't include the partition key, it might have to fan out across multiple partitions, which costs more RUs and is slower.
So you have to think differently about querying compared to, say, SQL Server.
You do. The article also mentioned some user feedback about LINQ integration in .NET feeling maybe a bit less natural sometimes, and the cursor-based pagination being a bit annoying for some developers used to simple offset limit. Minor things, maybe, but part of the learning curve.
And tooling. Any limitations there?
The main point was that the browser-based query editor in the Azure portal, while convenient for quick checks, isn't always ideal for really complex query development compared to a dedicated desktop IDE. Though the local emulator for development got a positive mention, that's definitely helpful for offline work and testing.
Right. Okay, so cost, complexity, partition keys, querying nuances, definitely things to be aware of. But despite these challenges, the article clearly shows companies are using it successfully. What are some of those real-world use cases?
Yeah, it gave some good examples. IoT and telematics came up makes sense with the need to ingest huge amounts of data quickly. Retail and e-commerce, definitely. The article mentioned Jet.com, which is now part of Walmart, using it for that elastic scale needed for peak seasons.
Gaming, too, I imagine. Low latency is key there.
Exactly. Gaming, social media apps, managing lots of user-generated content. The flexible schema helps there. And of course, those AI-driven applications we talked about, Heineken was mentioned as using it.
And some other big names.
Yeah, Rolls-Royce, Coca-Cola, Siemens Healthineers. These are companies with demanding, often global-scale applications. Their use cases really highlight that Cosmos DB can handle serious, mission-critical workloads when implemented correctly.
It shows the potential, even with the pitfalls. The article also touched on recent updates from Microsoft Build 2025.
It did, kind of a hot off the press section. It summarized the key things, enhancements to that native vector search we discussed,
Right.
The public preview of global secondary indexes, which could help with partition key issues, the JavaScript SDK v4.0 becoming generally available, and that seamless migration path from serverless to provision throughput.
So Microsoft is actively investing in evolving the platform.
Clearly, these updates show they're continuing to push Cosmos DB forward, especially for, modern data and AI scenarios.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. Based on this deep dive into the datapro.news piece, what's the final assessment? Is it the Swiss Army knife or something else?
Well, like the best answers in tech, the article concludes, it depends, doesn't it? If you're building globally distributed apps, if you absolutely need that low latency and massive scale, if you're heavily invested in AI with vector search, and particularly if you're already in the Azure ecosystem, then Cosmos DB is a really, really strong contender.
The flexibility of the multi-API support and the managed service aspect are big pulls.
Huge pulls, but, and it's a big but, you absolutely have to go in with your eyes open about the cost. You need to understand RUs, optimize proactively, and acknowledge the learning curve. Poor upfront design, especially around partitioning, can cause real pain later.
So not quite a simple pocket knife, maybe more like that sophisticated multi-tool the article mentioned.
That's a great way to put it. It's incredibly versatile, incredibly powerful. But you need to know how to use each attachment properly. For experienced teams willing to invest the time to understand it and manage it, it's a fantastic asset. But maybe not the first choice for every single data problem out there.
Right. So summing up our look at this datapro.news article on Azure Cosmos DB, immense power, great flexibility, but demands real thought about complexity and cost.
That nails it.
And that leads us to maybe a final thought for you, the listener. Thinking about that multi-tool analogy, look at your own data toolbox right now. Are there any specific tools, any database attachments that you think Cosmos DB could potentially replace or augment? What are the specific data challenges you're facing? Scale, latency, global distribution, AI integration, where a tool this versatile, even with its complexities, might actually be the most effective solution.
Yeah, it's worth pondering. How might these features map onto your own projects, your own learning path? Something to explore further.